It's The World This Week, The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast world editor. Nico Hines joins us from London. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Good evening.
All right, good to see you. We're also pleased to welcome Laure Mandeville, senior correspondent for French daily newspaper Le Figaro.
Hello.
How are things?
Good.
Good.
Yes.
All right. With us as well, Ana Navarro Pedro, Paris correspondent for Portuguese magazine Visão.
Indeed.
How are things?
Very good, and you?
Very good. Gosh, we've gone from good to very good. Okay. The
We have to.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. A grain of sand in a seemingly well-oiled machine, or in this case, a sandstorm, enough to push a giant cargo ship towards shore and block the Suez Canal. More than 150 ships, including many an oil tanker, left waiting at the mouth of a venue that's, the passageway for more than 10% of the world's maritime traffic. The latest attempt to refloat it unsuccessful. They're waiting on two more tugboats come Sunday. You know, Laure Mandeville, this reminds me a decade ago of, remember when there was that volcano in Iceland?
Yeah, I remember that.
These unforeseen events, like with COVID, these unforeseen events, and
Exactly.
this is one of them.
I agree. I think it's very striking that in this particular time when we are all, repeating that we're living in a virtual world, it is very striking that suddenly, the reality of geography, which is very obstinate, suddenly takes us back in the real world, and that suddenly this huge cargo of 400 meters long blocks the Suez Canal, which is responsible for 10 to 12%, of sea traffic. And that means suddenly a huge amount of economic, stakes in question. I find it in a way, fascinating and maybe even a bit refreshing to see that, that we still have to deal with the reality of the world. And I was reading that apparently this is happening because the length of these boats, I mean, their size has been tripled over 20 years. So how do you expect, a ship of 400 meters?
We've seen this with giant luxury cruise liners. And as Laure was saying, Ana Navarro Pedro, is this an accident that was just waiting to happen?
Oh, yes, of course. And there's this really extraordinary picture, this photo of the Suez Canal and two men with a kind of a shovel and an old-fashioned excavating machine trying to dig out 12% of world's economy in the canal. Of course, it's so telling, this picture. That's, we are supposed to be so intelligent, so up in the virtual world, and here it comes. It just shows us that we are not ready for it.
And so very few alternative routes as well. The route through the Cape of Good Hope is 9,000 miles bigger. And now the Russians, I think, are saying, look, guys, we have to diversify, so let's use the Arctic route, which is opening because of the melting of the ice. But it's, of course, ecologically quite dangerous.
Yeah, Victor Mallet is with us, Paris bureau chief of the Financial Times. Thanks for joining us here in the World This Week. Victor, we saw the price of oil spike and then come back down again. Nobody's that bothered about the fact that the Suez Canal is blocked?
Freed up, whether by the bulldozer or by the tugs or by something else. I mean, I think it's important to bear in mind that the world shipping industry was already under incredible stress. There's a great shortage of containers. Freight rates have been spiking very sharply in recent months. So in a sense, this is just an added short-term problem, a very severe problem, but just one more issue for logistics of goods around the world, whether they are medical goods or industrial goods or whatever.
Right, and we will be, of course, talking about supply chains more. It seems to be the common thread in this edition. It was the week Germany's government, in the face of public outcry, had to backtrack on slapping the nation with an Easter weekend lockdown. There was even a public apology by the chancellor. Meanwhile, in Mallorca, the sun is shining, and despite the spread of new contagious variants of COVID, extra flights are on the Mediterranean islands, a choice destination for Germans at Easter.
We don't understand anything. We cannot understand how it is that we can go to another region and they can come from Germany or other countries. We cannannot understand it. It is incomprehensible. We will see next week if infections spike.
Nico Heinz, it's interesting because the Spanish seem divided over whether or not to let the tourists in.
Well, it's obviously that there's two strong sides to the argument, isn't it? Economically, they absolutely need the business that's driven by particularly German and British holidaymakers who go and spend huge amounts on the Spanish coast and in some of the major cities. But obviously, by bringing people in from all over the world, you're massively increasing your chances of getting some of these new variants or just mixing the virus back up into the population and helping it reignite. So I understand why it's such a tough decision. And it does seem like just taking our time, not rushing back into tourism, not rushing back on holiday, even though we desperately want to, must be the sensible answer.
Yeah, and there are limits in Spain. As we heard that woman, that pensioner say, going from one province to the other, there's a snap election coming up in the Madrid area, Nico, and it's become even a campaign issue, says our correspondent. Back in February, I know the Daily Beast reported on illicit Airbnb parties taking place in the Spanish capital that drew both French people sneaking over the border and locals.
It's human nature, isn't it? Whenever there's a set of rules written there are people desperately trying to find loopholes to sneak through. You know, we've got this new British rule that comes in on Monday that you get a £5,000 fine if you leave the country without a reasonable excuse, and going on holiday to get a bit of a tan is not deemed a reasonable excuse. And already we're seeing online people coming up with all sorts of devious ways in order to get themselves on holiday. Apparently, if you go and visit a property and say that you want to buy it, that counts as a loophole because it can be essential travel. So already people are kind of trying to come up with ways in order to make life a bit easier for them. And I can't blame them because it has been an awful year and we do all deserve to lie on a nice sunbed.
Ana Navarro-Pedro, the COVID strains, the new ones, they're more virulent than before. And yet, the Spanish have announced that travel restrictions for people coming from the UK are to be lifted as of March 30th. Your thoughts on that?
It's a drama because we know that in Portugal, we dealt with COVID very well last year, and then by Christmas time, government lifted all restrictions on foreigners coming to Portugal, tourists, and even for Portuguese traveling, and having a nice Christmas. And we have paid with about so many deaths ever since. We had restrictions. Even police would come at your homes in Portugal to check if you were there. That was the price we had to pay to curb down
and how do the Portuguese feel about tourists coming back?
We are doing the same as Spain. We cannot travel from province to province in Portugal, but tourists can come as long as they have a negative PCR test. Okay. The thing that maybe is going to save us is that Germany has declared Lisbon, all south of Portugal, Lisbon and all south of Portugal, as a zone. If German tourists go there, they will have to quarantine when they go back to Germany. So the north, it's okay. But the north, it's not very hot. So you can't bake in the sun and chill with frozen beer. So maybe that's what will save us. But the problem is indeed, our economies are dependent for about one-fifth of our economies depend on tourism. It's huge, absolutely huge, and people will slowly die from economic reasons, from lack of revenue, if the tourists don't come back. And when they come back, they will bring another spike in disease, and we'll go back to the same problem again.
So, Victor Mallet, for Easter, will you be going to Mallorca or Ibiza?
No, well, I don't think we're allowed to go anywhere at the moment, are we? I mean, I think you will find, though, Francois, that there have been illegal parties in Paris and in France, as well as in Spain and elsewhere. So, yeah, no, sadly, no travel plans. I mean, a lot of this really comes down to the fact that each country is in a slightly different phase of the pandemic. So, you know, it goes down in Germany and up in France, and then up in Italy and down in Spain, and then up in another part of Spain. And so you have everybody is kind of reinfecting everybody else. And this is the problem. And this is the reason why more and more countries are the ones that aren't opening up are trying to impose kind of restrictions on travel.
And what was your reaction on Tuesday when we saw the German Chancellor announce this Easter weekend lockdown, which she then backtracked on, while at the same time leaving open the possibility of going to Spain?
It was very bizarre, and you know, there's a contrast with France as well. She was apologizing essentially for having tried to impose a stricter lockdown. And we have Macron here in France being urged to apologise for not imposing a stricter lockdown, which he didn't do. He didn't apologise. But, you know, a lot of people today were complaining on social media that he should have apologised. So it's a very complex situation. And I wouldn't want to be a government trying to decide how to manage this crisis right now.
Well, let's talk about that non-apology. No flights to Mallorca over Easter for citizens of Lyon, France's second city, which after Paris is going into tightened confinement. No travel outside a 10-kilometer radius. Many in France wondering if the government should have decreed a national circuit breaker lockdown back in January. On that score, cue the orchestra and Edith Piaf's signature song, No Regrets.
I believe that we were right in January not to take lockdown measures, and that we were right afterwards to take other measures to put brakes on the pandemic. And depending on the evolution of the virus, we will take all the necessary measures in due course. And so in the next few days, we'll have new measures to take, and we'll take them all together in light of the facts, by being transparent. We will do it in real time.
Laurent, that was not an apology, was it?
It was not an apology, and to tell you the truth, I was actually sympathetic with Macron's attempt, you know, to keep the country open, because, you know, my preference was really to sort of try to continue living and opening the economy, but
the contrast is there, right, between an Angela Merkel who apologizes and a Macron who says we were right.
I know, but. You know, probably, yes, there is a contrast, but everyone is trying, you know, to its own way. It's complicated for everyone. In that particular case, I think there are really two opinions in France. You know, not all the French people are trying to ask Macron to shut down everything again and asking him. Some people are quite grateful that he kept the country more or less open. But you know, what is very terrible for him and for all the leaders at the moment is that this sort of going back and forth all the time and trying different recipes and not being very convincing and actually being at fault. I would criticize him much more for, you know, for instance, we were discussing that before the show, the absolutely inexplicable situation with the hospitals, that we are a year after this outbreak started, and we still have the same number of beds for people in.
They have made more capacity by canceling other non-essential surgery.
That is not dogmatic.
Yeah, but they haven't increased the capacity for this process, reanimation process. I don't know how you say that in English.
Intensive care.
Intensive care, yes. And for me, it's still up to now an enigma. Why is it not happening?
And it's also a mystery to me, the fact that in most of European Union, the authorities don't try to treat people as soon as they are sick. they let the illness go along and see how it evolves for each person. And in the end, we end up with dramatic situations. Why don't we treat right from the beginning? Of course, we have to mobilize more staff, even maybe people in retirement. We have to spend more money on health, but maybe in the end, we'll spend less money on dole, on unemployment payments or help to enterprises. And on top of it, going back to the vacation in Spain, tourism within European Union represents around 750 billion euros every year pre-COVID. It's a lot of money. It's an industry that's extremely important, and the whole economy is in every country is going to suffer, not only Portugal, Spain, and Italy and Greece. Everybody is going to suffer a lot. And our governments are not questioning the way they are dealing basically with this pandemic.
Nico Heinz, before we go to the break, are you surprised that here we are, end of March, and we're still having the same debates as 12 months ago? Is it enough? Is it too much? Should they have locked down more? Should they have kept the school open? Should they have shut the schools, etc.?
I'm extremely surprised. It seems like we've learned absolutely nothing. And what makes it even worse and compounds the error is that if people had got these vaccines out faster, it wouldn't be such a big problem. If you look at the rate of the wave in Israel at the moment, it started to go up for a new wave, but because so much of the population has already been vaccinated, it immediately went back down again. And France, because they've been so slow out of the gate getting these vaccines into people's arms, they're going to have to deal with another wave, and who knows when they're going to actually get the house in order and have those vaccines sorted.
All right, Nico, saying the V word, the perfect seg. We're going to talk about vaccines when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast World Editor. Nico Heinz is with us from London. Laure Monville, senior correspondent for French broadsheet Le Figaro. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Victor Mallet, Paris bureau chief for the Financial Times, and Ana Navarro.
Yes,
excuse me. Paris correspondent for Portuguese news weekly Visao.
Absolutely.
We talk about global supply chains in this show, the global supply chains of shipping, the flow of tourists, and how about the global supply chain of vaccine? Britain and the European Union calling a truce ahead of that virtual EU summit Thursday and Friday, where all parties, after paying close attention to the way vaccine ingredients move in all directions, getting in before they get into people's arms, well, leaders of the 27 toning down some post-Brexit grandstanding. By week's end, we graduated to the safer sport of simply bashing AstraZeneca.
We will make sure that everything stays in Europe until the company will come back to its commitment. And this is why we have this instrument that the President of the Commission yesterday again put in place to make sure that we control and we don't have any leakage, if I may say so.
So, Nico Heinz, you weren't with us last week, but we seem to be talking about AstraZeneca every week. I'll begin with you. They've had a brutal week. Remember, there was in the U.S. they hadn't given enough data for the approval. Then there was this factory. Turns out it was okay, the one in Italy. And yeah, more questions about what's in those contracts that they signed.
I think the story out of Italy, where it was reported and blared all over the world that they had a secret stockpile of 30 million vaccines hidden in a factory, which turned out to be complete nonsense, is quite indicative of this whole thing. We've reached a point of such hysteria now where the media is leaping on any sort of discrepancy it finds and therefore spinning stories up. And what's happened is because the leaders in many of the countries in Europe and elsewhere have done such a bad job job with the vaccine rollout, they're taking the opportunity to pass the buck and to blame it on AstraZeneca. Now, that's not to say that AstraZeneca haven't made mistakes, and the error in the US seems to have been really crass mistake. And, you know, if you provide the wrong data when there's such an important ruling about to come out and whether it's going to be allowed to be rolled out further in the US, you know, that is a really big error. But I think by far the biggest mistake that's been made is people like President Macron raising doubts so that people don't trust having this vaccine in the first place. It's all very well complaining about how much you've got in the country, but if you're not actually using it because you've scared your own countrymen away from having it injected into them, then there's not much point in having it shipped in, is there?
Normandville, do you agree?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what he said about
you
Macron at the
missed.
end.
He was saying that the biggest fault is not with AstraZeneca, but with Emmanuel Macron when he instilled that initial doubt over the vaccine.
Absolutely. I mean, if you express this doubt at the very moment when you're going to put this vaccine, in your country and trying to promote it, it's totally counterproductive. I think it's the whole story around vaccine in France has been pretty poor, and I think the French, in a way, have on the one hand, have had all the problems of bureaucratic problems of organizing the vaccination, and then also they've been very naive. I mean, he said, I think today or yesterday, it's the end of naivete. Now we are going to be very forceful.
Very bashed the EU, saying we didn't reach for the stars.
Exactly. So he's bashing everyone, and as if the French are not have no responsibility. I think that the French didn't behave sufficiently, vigorously on this front.
But Ana Navarro Pedro, on this point, I mean, Germany's at the same point as us, and they're the ones who discovered the BioNTech vaccine, but they're at the same
we
position.
are seeing several things here. We are seeing the end globally of the vaccine diplomacy, because we are seeing that we cannot globally produce, I say we, I include the planet, produce the amount needed of vaccines in order to curb the pandemic or the epidemic this year. So everybody is now starting to say to do as the United States and the United Kingdom. They have exported 0 vaccines. United States gave some crumbs this week to Mexico and Canada, but that was it, 0. Whereas Europe, who is producing, whereas China, who is producing, and India, who are producing, have been exporting around 45% of what they are producing. So India now has stopped exporting. They say that they will respect all the deals that they've made so far, but they won't make any further until they vaccinate their own country first. So we are seeing the end of the vaccine diplomacy. We are seeing the end of this European common strategy of making a common deal of vaccines for Europe. Yes, Brussels was very, very naive. Brussels was very weak, and Brussels is not being very intelligent on all this affair.
But you couldn't have done it any other way. You needed to have joint procurement. Otherwise, smaller nations like perhaps Portugal, wouldn't have gotten their share.
Well, we don't know. We
don't know. Okay.
But now the result is that everyone is looking for vaccines. Trying to set some association. With the Russians. You've seen the Hungary, Czech Republic trying to get a vaccine also in Israel. I mean, it's becoming like sauf qui peut.
I want to pick up on what you said there. It's not just Europe where COVID cases, by the way, are spiking. India is grappling with a surge. The western Maharashtra state, alarmed by what's being dubbed a double mutant variant. There, too, an ambitious vaccine campaign, very slow off the mark. And the Serum Institute, which is vital most notably for AstraZeneca's jab, making it clear that in the face of the emergency, it's going to have to be India first. Victor Mallet, can it be any other way?
Well, I think it can. I mean, a lot of people have criticised the vaccination programmes in Europe, especially, for being slow. But the real underlying problem, if you look at across Europe, pretty much everyone is more or less the same position. The issue is really supplies, and every country has had restricted supplies, except more or less Israel, the UK, and the US. And I think, as one of our debaters just said, a very large share of the UK vaccination programme came from European factories of BioNTech, Pfizer. So the problem is not really that France is useless at vaccinating people. Or that Germany is no good at vaccinating people. It's that they haven't got the supply. And yes, the EU can be faulted perhaps for not having the right procurement programs in place. And that situation will, I think, be resolved, or at least will begin to be resolved in the coming weeks, because we are going to have a greater flow of vaccines coming from several different types of vaccines, including now the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And that will ease things up. And then the pressure will really be on whether or not countries are capable of vaccinating at a very high rate. I mean, France is already up to, I think yesterday was like 380,000 or more vaccines in one day, which is not bad for France. And, you know, given their supply constraints, that's pretty okay. The question now is whether they can get up to 1 million a day once they have the sufficient supply.
But there is this sort of atmosphere of suspicion, and we heard the new Director General of the World Trade Organization lash out this week at the new red tape that was rubber stamped by that EU summit when it comes to export authorizations for COVID-19 vaccines. Let's listen.
So whilst we understand the politics of what they are doing, I've said openly I'm disappointed, particularly in the fact that they extended it from March. March 31 had been the declared stop, and now it's been extended to June. And I'm actively talking to them about how we can make sure that this restriction is dealt with.
Victor Mal, your reaction to the words there of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala?
But don't forget, those restrictions, as he said, have been in place for 2 months, and they've simply been extended. And the EU pointed out that this is, well, you know, they implied that this is basically a sort of diplomatic statement rather than a real restriction. Only one shipment of vaccines from the EU out of more than 300, nearly 400, has actually been stopped, and that was 250,000 vaccines from AstraZeneca that were due to go from Italy to Australia. And apart from that, all the vaccine approvals have gone through, and the Europeans, including the French, have said, look, we have no problem with BioNTech, Pfizer. They're meeting their contractual obligations to us. It is really a problem of AstraZeneca. And the problem is that Europe, especially Eastern Europe, was relying very heavily on AstraZeneca for the early stages of its vaccination campaigns. And that is precisely why we have a huge problem in Europe in particular now, as opposed to the UK and the US.
All right, the week that began with tit-for-tat sanctions over China's crackdown on the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang province, well, it's escalated further. Burberry, the latest clothing retailer to find itself cancelled on Chinese social media over a not so new, in fact, it dates back, a stance taken against using forced labor in the extraction and transformation of cotton from Xinjiang province. That's on top of new sanctions against prominent UK critics of China, including the former Tory leader, Ian Duncan Smith.
To deal with their roughshod behaviour, we can only communicate with them in ways that are apprehensible and memorable for them. I think by and by they will get used to it.
They will get used to it, Laurent.
Yeah, I think, you know, we're seeing this sort of assertiveness, of rising assertiveness of the Chinese, who do not, whether it comes from business companies or from political, from country, you know, other countries and political leaders, are less and less accepting of you know, criticism or raising flags on what they do, and using, you know, sort of threatening tone and sanctioning. So there is this sort of escalation that we see, and with all these companies which for years actually were closing their eyes on very dubious practices, labor practices in China. It's not started yesterday, but now in the context that we see politically, where countries in the West are criticizing China for the Uyghur situation, they are sort of joining in and sort of saying we cannot accept this, which is a good thing. But what I think is that the Chinese have very strong capacity to sort of dismiss this, because they're going to replace their company, whether it is H&M or others, by Chinese lines.
Well, let me ask on that point, Nico Heinz. We saw, for instance, the Chinese athletic shoe brand Anta, which has left the Better Cotton Initiative, which is this statement of good intention on the part of those in the clothing industry, and their share prices Friday soaring. Do you agree with Laure that it's just going to be benefits for domestic brands now?
It could well be. I mean, it's very interesting to see, this is a kind of real challenge to globalization, isn't it? We're reaching a point now where China is going to be so forthright and so controlling over companies which exist in their space that companies, major international brands who've been trying to break into China because there's huge profits to be made there, as well as all of the manufacturing power, are going to have to decide whether they want to be a truly global country, which also operates in China, or whether they want to stick to the old Western Hemisphere. And it's going to be a moment of kind of, is there going to be a bipolar world trade system? Or because there's no way that China are going to start backing down. They're going to become increasingly powerful and increasingly strong. And as is clear from these comments, they're going to become increasingly assertive. I thought it was interesting, Joe Biden said that China clearly wanted to become the world's leading and most powerful nation. And he said, not on my watch. But Joe Biden's 78 years old, so that doesn't give us too much prospect of safety looking forward.
Let's listen to Joe Biden. In his first formal press conference as U.S. president, he talked of plans for a summit of nations that share democratic values.
I predict to you, your children or grandchildren are going to be doing their doctoral thesis on the issue of who succeeded, autocracy or democracy, because that is what is at stake. Not just with China. Look around the world. We're in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution of enormous consequence. Will there be middle class? How will people adjust to these significant changes?
Victor Mallet, what's the answer?
Well, if autocracy succeeds, they won't be doing their theses on any such thing because there won't be much academic freedom, I'm afraid.
Exactly.
But I think Nico was right in saying that it's about globalization, and it's about this kind of potentially bipolar world that we're going to end up with, especially with tech companies. With other kinds of consumer goods companies, I think it's not so serious, but you can already see a division in the world of internet companies and tech companies between the Chinese sphere and the Western sphere. And that is going to be a huge challenge. And one of the problems with confronting China, which is becoming much more assertive, is that despite all the talk from the US and from Europe and from the UK, actually, trade with China has been booming, and both under Trump and still going on now. So it is going to be a very tricky business to try and sort of wean German car producers, for example, off their dependence on the China market, if that's what people want to do. It is a huge challenge for globalization. I agree that there's no sign that China is going to sort of back down, but I think China is also going to discover that being a superpower is tricky, because people hate you, as they often hated the US back in the 1970s.
Anna Navarro.
Yes, but on China's side, that's not the debate today, but on China's side, there is kind of this revenge, historical revenge against the countries that have colonized them. So this is really a kind of cement of the people of China with their leaders, even if they are not happy sometimes with the way they are ruling the country. So that's one thing. But it will be very interesting to see how this crisis unfolds, because platforms, the internet platform Chinese have blocked out these companies, and this is a huge loss in very, very few days for these companies. And secondly, let's see if they are going to present excuse and become like carpets in front of the Chinese government in order to save their billing and sales, or if they will stand with the Western democracies, who are, by the way, that's not a debate again, but who are also restricting the democratic build within our Western democracies.
How so, you mean?
With restrictions. COVID, it's one of the examples, but we've had restrictions on protests, we have restrictions on freedom of speech. Little by little, we have seen this kind of peau de chagrin, as the French call it, this kind of shrinking of our democratic field, and we should watch for it as well.
All right, very briefly before we go, because we saw a clip there of Joe Biden. It was his first press conference in the limelight, as Nico pointed out, 78 years young. And we should take a look at it. He did at times go a little off script during that presser, like when he was asked about Central American migrants who make the desperate journey to the U.S. border.
People don't want to leave. When my great-grandfather got in a coffin ship in the Irish Sea, the expectation was he going to live long enough on that ship to get to the United States of America. But they left because of what the Brits have been doing. They were in real, real trouble.
You hear that, Nico? They left because what the Brits had been doing?
Yeah, Joe Biden is really strong on this. It's interesting. It's something that I don't think the British government realised. Joe Biden has for years, well, he's been around for so long, for decades has been a strong supporter of Irish republicanism and has often made jabs at Britain. And I think London's actually been a bit taken aback by how much he keeps hammering Britain for its past mistakes. And let's be honest, there were massive, massive mistakes, especially in Ireland.
Okay.
Laure Mondeville, how did he do in that press conference?
Well, I mean, I didn't watch it all, but I think the...
Why didn't you watch it all? You got bored?
No, I was busy with
Okay.
other things, but I thought, he was... he's not a great speaker. He at least there was not, a catastrophe, but there were bizarre moments where he just, didn't speak or didn't answer on the question of filibuster, or he was sort of trying to deny it and didn't answer. He was pressed by the journalists. So I think they are still being very nice to him in comparison to what was happening to Trump, where it was sort of, a sort of boxing match between the journalist and Trump. But I just wanted to go back to the fact that he's pushing this idea that there is going to be this sort of huge ideological fight between democracies and autocracies, and that's the coming fight. And I think that some of the observers have underlined the fact that maybe he shouldn't push too far the rhetorical. His rhetorical game on this issue, precisely because there are so many, actors which are totally in a dilemma. Both, all these companies who are trying to make money, and money has no smell, and they still want to go to China, and also countries. When you look at Europe, I'm not sure that the Europeans are all siding like one man with Joe Biden on this very fight, and the Chinese know that, and they're playing a long game. They are building up their economic strength. And so it's going to be very interesting. And I think, of course, the technological issue is absolutely key. And he should convince the Europeans to go with him along, on building up some kind of technological basis, because this is where the fight will be. If the Chinese sort of prevail in technological terms, the West will be in very big trouble.
Tech will be the battleground. That'll be the final word. I want to thank you, Laure Mondeville. I want to thank as well Ana Navarro Pedro, Victor Mallet, Nico Hines in London. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.